Hello and welcome to Global Insight, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Also Young. Now, China has seen the greatest eruption of unprecedented anger from its citizens in years after a deadly apartment fire set off nationwide protests against COVID-19 lockdowns. Protesters called for President Xi Jinping to step down, a rare direct criticism against the leadership of the ruling Communist Party. Then news of the death of former leader Jiang Jemin, who ruled during the heydays of the country's modernization and opening up, triggered a wave of mourning. Will the public anger and lament turn into a powerful force against Xi Jinping's rule, or will it dissipate? We turn to Nari, Professor of Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and Baogang, FASSA Alfred, Deakin Professor and Chair in International Relations at Deakin University. Very warm welcome to you both. Thank you for joining us today. And my first question to you, Professor Pure. Now, the zero COVID policy that the Chinese government's been imposing on its people, it's been frustrating many Chinese citizens for months and months. But what's led to this eruption of the protests, to the extent of them actually spreading to some other countries as well?
Well, before we start, you must know that China and Chinese used to be very patient. As a China observer, if I have to choose one characteristic of Chinese, I would say it's patient. But COVID pandemic situation broke out in the world since 2019, the winter time. So it's already past like 3 years. And China was under a blockade and extremely strict control. So if I were there in Beijing, I couldn't tolerate it any longer. Well, we actually had a similar situation almost for a year. But in Korea, dissenting voices had grown. It started from a small-scale businessman. But even Chinese are very patient, but there must be a limit. They're not living under a situation of war, but they still need to live under a extremely strict control for more than 3 years. It's a very stressful thing. I personally have a child who has nose bleeding issue, and sometimes it takes like half an hour to stop her bleeding. And let's say if she has to go to school in Beijing, sometimes she has to take PCR test once every couple days. And if she had to get through this situation for 3 years, it can be cause very similar situation for her. So if so, as a parent, how much longer can you put up with this situation, even if it's a Chinese parent? And moreover, China is not completely cut off from the outside world. Even if the government tries to control the media and SNS, but they still got another media and another SNS. They have friends and family who lives in overseas countries. And in many other ways, they're connected to the outside world. So they know in the United States or Europe or neighboring countries, including Japan, Korea, and even Taiwan, are almost Eastern control. So it might be okay if you think we are all under a very tough situation equally, but once you start the comparison, it makes people very uncomfortable. I'm holding up in a tough situation like this, but all the other people in other countries are quite free. That makes it very uncomfortable. And especially at this moment, some event or accident happens, it will play a pivotal role to express each individual's frustration. And just like Oromochi fire case recently happened, could be the case that led to the eruption.
Right, and also seeing images of unmasked fans at the World Cup as well, that stirred a reaction as well. And of course, as you said, the Chinese citizens have been very patient for 3 years, and it's worth remembering that other countries in the world, even in Europe, they saw some protests when the governments first imposed their policies. So the Chinese have been incredibly patient. And in that regard, Professor Han, now how significant is it that the protests were calling for President Xi Jinping himself to step down?
I think that this protest is significant for Chinese citizens fighting for freedoms. And they are also fighting against this severe surveillance system. You know, in China, you know, there's some green, yellow, red code. It's really kind of amazing. They have such a rigid system. If your mobile phone turn into yellow or red, then you can't move around. So they're really fighting for their freedom. So there are some that call for President Xi Jinping to step down, but this is unlikely to happen. China is not South Korea. I was in Korea 2 weeks ago. On the Saturday, I personally witnessed the public demonstration in South Korea. And it's very civilized, well organized. It's very impressive. But in China, they have the system was set up in such a way. If there's something wrong, it's not the problem with the president. It's something who are in charge. He is responsible. So in that sense, so the calling for President Xi Jinping step down probably unlikely to happen.
And Professor He, why was it so important for President Xi Jinping to retain his zero COVID policy? I mean, some people are hoping that the National Party Congress would, that meeting would get rid of it, but he very much retained it. So why is it so important for the leadership?
So there are several reasons. So if we think about the before 20 Party Congress, so they want to ensure the Party Congress will be held kind of in the organized manners without any disruptions from the COVID. But today, some local government start to use this zero COVID policy as a form of social political control. That makes the people angry. So the people say through it. Before they thought it was a public health issue, they can accept it, tolerate it. But when they say the biggest World Cup in the quarters, and millions of people watch the game without wearing mask, so then it was not a big issue in China. So this is kind of it was a big. That is one of the reasons Chinese are protest, and for Chinese, CCP want to retain the zero COVID policy. As I said, it's as a form of social political control. Plus, there are some really practical issues. So the Chinese vaccine rates is low, in particular old people is very low, and also effective of Chinese vaccine is also low. It's about 60%. So if you combine those two facts, and if there's widespread, then China will face severe test how to cope this, how public hospital to cope with the COVID. So that's a real issue, real life issue. And because the Western country, people already kind of get used to it, but the Chinese are always locked down for the last 3 years. If suddenly it spread, the population is so huge, the intensity of the city, so then spread will be widely like a fire. So that is the worry about too.
Right, and Chinese citizens, of course, because of the free medical care system, they visit hospitals quite frequently. But as you mentioned, Professor He, the vaccination rate has been quite low. And, well, Professor Pyo, now my question to you is, well, why has this vaccination program been, well, largely unsuccessful? And why do you think President Xi is resisting importing foreign vaccines?
Well, China, they claimed they developed a COVID vaccine just after a year when the pandemic just started, and which means that China is not full behind on the competition between technology with Western technology, especially the biotechnology. So it is not simple that just right now China start to mention that, oh, actually Chinese vaccine is not effective. At the same time, European or American vaccine is quite good, so we're just going to buy that. You cannot just say like that, because it can be a problem of an owner in a country like China, who got the leadership, got the authoritarian author, the kind of authoritarian state. And plus, it can be damaged to the keynote of their policy, which calls Made in China 2025. So for China, it's not a very simple question that what are you going to buy? Which one is the greater vaccine? For them, it's more about it. So I think that's one of the reasons why Xi Jinping has to continue this kind of vaccine policy.
I see. And Professor He, well, a few days ago we heard that former General Secretary Jiang Jemin, he passed away. And well, in the past we saw, the likes of we saw protests form when after the deaths of former leaders, the Premier Zhou Enlai and former General Secretary Hu Yaobang. And do you think we might see the protests that were going on right now because of the zero COVID policy really transform into something bigger?
It's unlikely to happen for the two reasons. So first, in terms of like that, when the Zhou Enlai passed away, then the people are kind of march into Tiananmen Square. But if you physically today, if you look at the Chinese traffic system, and so complex, it's even physically, it's difficult to walk into the Tiananmen Square now. The second is the surveillance system. China have a well-established this systematic surveillance system. But people do commemorate Jiang Zemin for his very wise management of, say, example, Hong Kong issue, and in particular, his kind of very easy manner manages the United States. So this is people think this is the way China should be kind of modernized, have a kind of modern diplomacy to handle the relationship better. So there are, in particular, this time it's very amazing. Hong Kong people kind of voluntarily commemorate Jiang Zemin on the street. That's an amazing phenomenon. But that's probably as a form of the protest too. We can read in this way. This is their express their way that they don't like the current Chinese Hong Kong policy, but they like the Jiang Zemin's period, the way he handled Hong Kong issue.
I see. And on that note, Dr. Pyo, what kind of leader, what kind of figure was former General Secretary Jiang Zemin to the Chinese public?
Well, Jiang Jemin was of bureaucratic origin, so he definitely was not a charismatic person like Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping. But in the post-Cold War era, which was a period of huge transition, Jiang Zemin could keep China safe. I think that was the most important. And he could continue the reform and open up policy, so he could make base of recent China's prosperity. And in international relations, he made lots of changes. Actually, diplomatic relations between Korea and China was also made in Jiang Zemin period. And what I heard from my Chinese friend, he could understand international system and regime and Western system. So he was not a typical Chinese kind of leader. The communist leader, just like the former ones. So just because of his attitude and his character, before he was considered as a transitional leader when he was there. But now he rather receives a favorable evaluation than when he was in power.
Right, of course, and he kind of bears a sharp contrast with the current leader, former President Zhang, having been very international, often singing Western songs even, lots of stories about him. But, well, Professor He, before you go, how do you think the leadership in Beijing is going to really respond to these spurt of protests? Do you think ending the zero COVID policy is going to be enough for protesters? Because, well, interestingly, that does seem to be their main focus rather than calling for maybe, human rights or democracy. I mean, that seems to be a little less than their call for the end to zero COVID.
So currently Beijing has started revise this zero COVID policy and start to relax a little bit, modify it. And that has given us some Chinese a little bit social freedom. They can move around a little bit. So that can accommodate some of the demands. So the issue currently, the COVID, the protest against the zero COVID policy is largely fighting for social freedom. Social freedom. They really want to have a right to move around. But it's not, so far, it's not the fighting for political freedom, not fighting for political rights. So as you just said, it's not focused on the democracy issue. But I think that in the near future, when the China we will say when they relax, and they will face how to cope with this widespread COVID. It be a test for China. The Western country, South Korea, had experienced this long time ago. So China will kind of try to learn how to cope with. And in particular, this economic situation is very, very bad for many, many Chinese, ordinary Chinese people. So this post-COVID economic recovery is so critical. When the economic suffer, and then we will witness more Chinese protests out of kind of life necessity. But this time, there's a social protest. One of is kind of for fighting for social freedom. But the other very important reason is really for fighting for their survival. They are run out of money. They need a freedom to earn a bit of income. Now that's the CCP cannot overlook it. They cannot ignore. This force so huge. And the issue is still there because even you relax the vaccine, relax the policy. But the people, so many people are unemployed, so many people can lose their money. How do they survive? It's a tough issue for many Chinese.
Well, that's something that President Xi Jinping and the leadership will have to address in the years to come. And well, this is where we'll have to wrap up today. That was Nari, Professor at Korea National Diplomatic Academy, and Baogang, Deakin Professor and Chair in International Relations at Deakin University. Thank you again so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Also, thank you to our viewers for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow here in South Korea, so have a great day wherever you are. Goodbye.